An American mafia boss couldn't sleep for 6 years, until his new maid arrived. 6 years. For 6 long years, the most feared man in Detroit, a man who made judges nervous and made problems disappear, could not close his eyes past 2:04 a.m. without the world fracturing underneath him. Doctors prescribed everything. Specialists flew in from Chicago, New York, Johns Hopkins, sleep studies, medication cocktails, therapy from a psychiatrist who lasted exactly 2 sessions before deciding he didn't want to know what lived behind Marcus Vale's eyes. They charged fortunes. They delivered nothing, because what Marcus carried was not a condition. It was a debt, and no prescription in the world has ever been written for that. Every night at exactly 2:04 a.m., the most powerful man in Michigan relived the night his brother died, saving his life. Not a dream. A memory. Precise, personal, and inescapable. His estate became a mausoleum. Staff quit without explanation, sending polite messages through intermediaries, never brave enough to quit to his face. Security rotated in silence. Even the air inside those iron gates felt wrong, heavy and unresolved, like the house itself had absorbed the grief and refused to let it go. Then, without warning and without his permission, his aunt hired someone new. A maid named Amara, sent through an agency in Dearborn, arrived on a Wednesday morning with 1 bag and a quality no one in that household had seen in 6 years. She was not afraid of him. And somehow, impossibly, on the very first night she stepped into that kitchen, the man who had not slept in 6 years finally closed his eyes. But when his doctor arrived at the estate the next morning, briefcase in hand, already braced for the usual devastation, what he found in that kitchen stopped him completely cold. Welcome back. Today we step into the heart of Detroit, where power and grief share the same zip code, and where the most dangerous man in the city had one enemy he could not negotiate with, threaten, or destroy: himself. This is the story of Marcus Vale, the man who built Detroit's most feared empire from silence, loyalty, and controlled violence. And Amara, the one woman who walked into his darkness without flinching and somehow brought him back to the light. Pull up a chair. Detroit doesn't tell stories gently, but this one is worth every word. To understand what Amara walked into, now you have to understand what Marcus Vale built, and what it cost him to build it. Because the man standing at the upper landing of that Grosse Pointe estate the morning she arrived was not the man Detroit had whispered about for 15 years. Not entirely. He was what remained of that man after 6 years of a punishment no courtroom had ordered and no lawyer could appeal. This is where the story really begins. Not with the empire. Not with the fear his name generated or the silence that followed him through the corridors of Detroit's most dangerous circles. It begins on a January night so cold the Detroit River had started to freeze at its edges. A parking garage off Woodward Avenue, a deal going wrong in the specific, irreversible way deals go wrong when someone inside your circle decides their loyalty was never permanent. And a younger brother named Danny, who stepped forward before Marcus could move. She arrived on a Wednesday morning like a change in weather. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a black car rolling through the iron gates at 9:30, and a woman stepping out of it with a single travel bag and the unhurried composure of someone who had already decided, somewhere between Dearborn and Grosse Pointe, that this place would not be a problem. Her name was Amara. She moved through the entrance courtyard the way certain people move through difficult rooms, not braced against them, not performing ease, simply unbothered in the specific way of a woman for whom unbothered was not a strategy but a baseline. The gravel crunched under her feet. The iron gates closed behind her. She didn't look back. "Mrs. The Carol intercepted her before she reached the front steps. The head housekeeper was a small, precise woman who had survived 3 years in the Vale estate by perfecting the art of invisibility, and she delivered the briefing the way she delivered everything, efficiently, quietly, and without room for questions. Don't make eye contact if he passes. Don't linger in any room he enters. Don't ask about the East Wing, the locked study, or anything you think you hear after midnight. And if you feel the house go a particular kind of quiet, not peaceful quiet, the other kind, you have 60 seconds to make yourself scarce. Learn the difference fast. That's the one thing that matters here. Amara listened to every word. Then she nodded. Not the quick, anxious bob of a woman cataloging her own fear. A slower nod, deliberate. The nod of someone who had received information, processed it, and filed it in the appropriate place. Acknowledged, not internalized as terror. Mrs. Carroll studied her for a moment with the expression of a woman who wanted to say more and decided against it. "You'll understand soon enough," her eyes said instead. She turned toward the entrance. Amara followed. He was watching from the upper landing. Marcus stood back from the railing the way he stood in every room, present enough to observe, removed enough to stay unreadable. He had watched 11 people arrive through those gates. He had cataloged, with the dispassionate precision of a man who trusted patterns above everything, the exact moment each one of them felt the house find them, the subtle falter in the step, the shoulders drawing up, and the eyes dropping to the floor and staying there. It usually took less than 30 seconds. Amara crossed the entrance foyer. He watched. He waited for the tell. She reached the center of the room, and then, without any sound from above, without any signal she should have been able to detect, she looked up, directly at him, not startled, not searching, as though she had known precisely where he was standing for the last 2 minutes and had simply chosen this moment to confirm it. She held his gaze for 2 steady seconds. Then she gave him one small, unhurried nod. The greeting of one person acknowledging another. Nothing performed, nothing owed. And she followed Mrs. Carroll down the hall without breaking stride. Marcus stood at the railing long after she had gone. Something moved in his chest, faint, unclassifiable, and he had not felt anything new in 6 years. He filed it, the way he filed everything that didn't fit, turned from the railing, walked back to his study, closed the door behind him. The feeling did not follow instructions. He found her there an hour later, his study, the forbidden room, not by any posted rule, but by the accumulated authority of a man whose entire household understood instinctively that certain spaces were not entered without invitation. The shelf along the far wall held 3 things: a row of financial files, an unopened bottle of Blanton's, and a framed photograph of Danny. Laughing at a Tigers game, summer before everything ended, his arm thrown around Marcus's shoulders like the world was simple, Amara was dusting the shelf, methodically, without apology. She turned when he entered, not with a start, but with the natural timing of someone who had heard him coming and hadn't considered it an emergency. "This room isn't on your rotation," Marcus said. His voice carried the specific calibration he used when precision mattered more than volume. "Mrs. Carroll updated the list this morning," she said evenly. "Said this shelf hadn't been touched in weeks." "Mrs. Carroll doesn't have authority over this room." "She may not have known that." No heat in it, no challenge, just the clean transfer of accurate information between 2 people. He crossed the room and stopped in front of the desk. His eyes went to the photograph. It had moved, not significantly, 3 inches to the left of where it had always stood. But he knew its position the way he knew everything in this room, because nothing in here had been touched in 6 years. And that was precisely the point. "You moved it," he said. Amara glanced at the shelf. "It was at the edge, another inch, and it would have gone over when I worked around it." A pause. "I can put it back if you want. I noted where it was." He looked at the photograph. Danny mid-laugh, mid-summer, mid-life, 3 inches from the edge. Safe now. Something caught in his throat that wasn't grief. Or wasn't only grief. Something quieter than that. "Leave it where you put it," he said, and walked out. In the corridor, he stopped, stood without destination for a moment, one hand at his side, the other not quite making a fist. She hadn't challenged him. She had simply changed the space around him, and that was so much more dangerous. The estate darkened the way it always did, gradually, deliberately, like something bracing itself. By 10 o'clock, the staff had retreated to their quarters with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the later hours belonged to a different atmosphere entirely. The lights dimmed on their automatic sequence. Detroit burned orange and white beyond the perimeter walls, the city perpetually alive, perpetually indifferent. While inside the Vale estate, the silence thickened into something with weight and edges. Marcus sat at the foot of his bed, not lying down. He had learned in the first weeks that horizontal felt like surrender, like offering himself to it without resistance. So he sat, back straight, hands on his knees, a man at attention before a firing squad that ran on its own schedule. The clock on the wall read 1:45. The restlessness came first, always in his legs. A low, electric unease that had no physical origin and no physical remedy. By 1:55 it reached his hands. By 2 o'clock his breathing had changed, shortening into the shallow, controlled pulls of a man who had learned that discipline was the only thing standing between him and complete collapse. By 2:03 he stopped breathing entirely, not because he forgot, because he already knew what was coming. And then, from somewhere below, a sound, soft, rhythmic, the quiet, unhurried movement of someone working in a kitchen without urgency, without performance, simply present in the way that living things are present, domestic, warm, so entirely out of place in this house at this hour that Marcus sat with it for a full 10 seconds before his body made the decision his mind hadn't finished making yet. And he was moving down the corridor before he knew he'd stood up. The kitchen light was on. Amara stood at the stove with her back to him, stirring something in a small pot with the patience of someone for whom patience was not an effort, but simply a way of existing. And the smell. The smell was the detail that stopped him physically, one hand still on the door frame. Warm, earthy and layered, herbal and faintly sweet, the smell of somewhere people were taken care of. A smell that belonged to kitchens where someone always came home. He had not smelled anything like it in this house in 6 years. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Flat, controlled, the sentence designed to end situations. Amara finished one slow rotation of the spoon. Then another. She poured the contents carefully into a cup. The steam rising in a quiet column in the still air. Then she turned. She did not look like someone caught. "I know," she said without tremor. "But you are." She crossed the kitchen and held the cup out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "What is it?" "Something my grandmother made," she said simply, "when the night got too loud." The clock on the kitchen wall read 2:03. His hands were shaking. The deep, joint-level tremor that lived below the reach of willpower, his body's nightly confession of everything his face refused to show. She saw it. She didn't react to it. She simply continued holding the cup with the steady patience of someone who had decided to wait as long as necessary and meant it completely. He took it. The warmth moved through his palms immediately, up through his wrists, into the locked muscles of his forearms, and into the rigid architecture of a man who had been braced for impact every night for 6 years. Not like medication, not the blunt chemical interruption of something forcing the body into compliance. This was slower, gentler, like something being reminded, carefully and without demand, of its original state. Amara turned slightly away and began to hum. Low, barely audible, not quite a song. The emotional residue of one, the shape of something ancient and unhurried that moved through the kitchen the way the warmth moved, filling the space without crowding it, occupying air that had been empty for so long it had forgotten what presence felt like. 2:04. He knew it without looking. His whole body knew it. 6 years of precise, clock-stamped suffering had made that minute as familiar as his own name. He waited for the cold, for the concrete floor of the Woodward Avenue garage, for the specific weight of Danny's body and the terrible speed at which warmth had left it, for the sound, that quiet, suppressed sound that didn't match what it took from him. He waited. The hum continued, low and steady as a held hand. The clock ticked past. 2:05. "You are not there anymore," Amara said softly without turning. "You are here." His legs decided before he did, heavily, the cup still wrapped in both hands, the hum moving its slow, grounding circuit through the warm air around him. He did not fight it. For the first time in 6 years, there was nothing to fight. The dread had simply released, the way a fist releases when the thing it's been holding finally lets go. His breathing slowed, his hands steadied, and the permanent load-bearing weight in his chest lifted. Not completely, not forever, but enough. Enough to breathe past, enough to feel the warmth of the cup, the solidity of the chair, the reality of a kitchen that was lit and inhabited and present. His eyes closed, not in resignation, in rest. Dr. Okafor arrived at 7 the next morning the way he arrived every morning, with the punctual resignation of a man whose job had become the documentation of a condition he could not treat. He had his briefcase, his prescription pad, 4 years of carefully worded notes on a patient whose decline he had been helpless to reverse. Mrs. Carroll met him at the door. Her expression stopped him before she spoke. He followed her to the kitchen. Marcus sat slumped in the chair, head tilted slightly to one side, both hands resting open in his lap. No longer gripped, no longer braced, simply open. The way hands rest when the body has finally released everything it was holding. His breathing was slow and deep, and completely without the shallow, effortful quality it carried in every waking hour the doctor had ever observed. His face was at rest. One chair away, Amara sat composed and awake, her hands folded in her lap, her posture carrying the quiet steadiness of a woman who had chosen to stay and had never once considered leaving. She looked up when they appeared in the doorway. She raised one finger to her lips. Dr. Okafor set his briefcase down in the corridor. Very slowly, as though a sudden sound might break something irreplaceable. He stood in that doorway for a long time, watching a chest rise and fall, steady, deep, yes, and real, and felt the particular disorientation of a man whose every medical model had just been quietly, completely disproven. The dragon was gone. Only a man remained. A tired, ordinary, deeply exhausted man who had finally, in a kitchen that smelled of something warm, found his way back to his own body. But peace in Marcus Vale's world has never come without a price. While he slept in that kitchen chair, hands open, face unguarded, more vulnerable than he had been in 6 years. Across the city, in a room overlooking the Detroit River, a phone was already ringing, and the man who answered it had spent 9 years waiting for exactly this moment. What happens next will change everything. Stay with us. The morning light came over Detroit the way it always did, indifferent, unhurried, spreading across the river in flat silver sheets before climbing the glass faces of the downtown towers and eventually reaching the quieter, walled neighborhoods where men like Marcus Vale kept their lives behind iron and hedgerow. Inside the estate, something had shifted. Mrs. Carroll felt it when she unlocked the kitchen at 6:45. Dr. Okafor felt it in the doorway at 7. Even the house itself seemed to carry the morning differently, less compressed, less braced, the way a room feels after a window has finally been opened, after years of being sealed shut. Across the city, in a building on the 14th floor of a Rivertown high-rise, that officially housed a private holdings consultancy and officially employed 26 people and officially turned a modest, unremarkable profit. A phone had already rung. And Raymond Conti had already answered it. Ray Conti had been Marcus Vale's most trusted lieutenant for 9 years. In that time, he had stood in rooms where decisions restructured the criminal architecture of 3 Michigan counties. He had managed logistics, personnel, and the specific category of problem that could not be routed through legitimate channels and could not be left unresolved. He had done all of it with the quiet, load-bearing reliability of a man whose loyalty had never once been publicly questioned. Which was, of course, precisely the point. He stood now at the floor-to-ceiling window of his private office, hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the Detroit River. The water was flat and silver in the early light. A cargo freighter moved slowly along the far bank. And the city behind its reflection continued its morning without awareness of the conversation that had just concluded. The report was simple. Marcus had slept. The new maid, sent through an agency in Dearborn, hired without his knowledge by the aunt, had been present in the kitchen at 2:04 a.m. 1 cup, 1 night, no episode, no aftermath, no shattered glass, no 3 a.m. security alert, no doctor arriving at dawn to assess damage. Just a man asleep in a kitchen chair with his hands open. Ray processed this the way he processed all structural information. Without sentiment, without reaction, with the dispassionate precision of an engineer recalculating load-bearing tolerances after an unexpected shift in the foundation. Something had changed. The question was not whether that mattered. The question was how much time it left him, and he moved to his desk, opened the second drawer. The file was already there, had been there since Wednesday, since the first report of her arrival. Amara, her background, her schedule inside the estate, the specific hours she occupied the lower floor, the pattern noted in Ray's careful, exact handwriting across the inside cover. No episode recorded on any night she has been present in proximity to the kitchen. The file was labeled, in that same handwriting, with 2 words, the variable. Ray's logic required no moral architecture to support it. It was simply arithmetic. A man who sleeps is a man who heals. A man who heals is a man who stabilizes. A man who stabilizes is a man whose mind clears, whose instincts return, whose eyes begin to move across his organization the way they used to move, with the quiet, total attention of someone who built every piece of it and knows exactly where each piece belongs. 14 months. That was how long Ray had been making adjustments. Careful ones, invisible ones, the kind that only become visible to a man who is fully, clearly, dangerously awake. Marcus waking up was the one variable Ray's timeline could not absorb. He stood at the window for another long moment. The river moved below him, indifferent and continuous. Then he picked up his phone, dialed a number he had never stored under a real name, and waited for the answer. We don't hear what he said. We only see his face, still, composed, the expression of a man who has made a decision and crossed from the side of deliberation to the side of execution. The particular stillness of someone no longer weighing options, and simply waiting for the machinery to begin. He ended the call, set the phone face down on the desk, looked back at the river. Peace had entered the house on Lakeshore Drive. Ray Conti had spent 9 years understanding that peace, in their world, was never free. 2 weeks passed. The estate changed the way living things change, not in any single moment, not through any dramatic event, but slowly, from the inside out. The kind of change you only recognize in retrospect, when you try to remember what the air felt like before and find you can't quite reconstruct it anymore. Mrs. Carroll noticed it first. The kitchen used more than it had in years. The hallways in the morning carried something lighter than the usual atmosphere. Not happiness exactly, but the absence of dread, which in this house amounted to the same thing. Even the security rotation moved differently. The men at their posts with the slightly loosened posture of people who had been braced for an alarm that kept not coming. No one named what was happening. No one needed to. The routine had formed the way all necessary things form, without announcement, without agreement, without anyone sitting down to decide it. Amara present on the lower floor in the late hours, the kitchen light visible as a thin gold line beneath the door. The soft, unhurried sounds of her movement creating a perimeter of the ordinary around the hour that had been for 6 years entirely extraordinary. She never intruded. That was the precise and essential quality of what she offered, presence without pressure. She never asked about Danny. It never acknowledged the photograph on the study shelf or the locked east corridor, or the way Marcus's jaw tightened in the late afternoon when the light changed and the day began its slow approach toward dark. She did not treat him as a project. She treated him as a person having a very difficult time, which was both more accurate and more dignified than any framework anyone had offered him in 6 years. He had begun, without acknowledging it, to rely on it. On the 14th night, he fell asleep at the kitchen table again. When he surfaced at 4 a.m., rested, disoriented, briefly uncertain of where he was, the kitchen was still and quiet around him. The light above the stove burned low, and his hand, somewhere in the drift of sleep, had shifted across the table. His fingers rested near hers, not holding, not grasping, just near. And the unconscious proximity of a man whose body had made a decision his waking mind would never have permitted. He looked at it for a long moment in the 4 a.m. silence. Then he looked at her, awake. Watching him with the same steady, undemanding attention she carried everywhere, no amusement in it, no agenda, simply the quiet presence of a woman who had stayed because staying was what the moment required. He said nothing. He stood, straightened his shirt with the unhurried dignity of a man who had been seen in an unguarded moment and was choosing deliberately not to be diminished by it. Walked back through the darkened corridor to his room. He was asleep again before 5. But something else was happening, quieter than the healing, and in its own way more significant. His mind was coming back online. Thus 2 weeks of actual sleep, real sleep, the deep, restorative kind his body had been starved of for 6 years, had done what no specialist had managed. It had returned him to himself. Not fully, not without remainder, but enough. Enough that when he sat at his desk in the mornings now, moving through his organization's reports with the focused attention of a man whose eyes had finally cleared, he was reading them the way he used to read them, completely. Between the lines as well as on them. The discrepancy appeared on a Thursday, Eastern District Revenue reporting, a number that was technically within acceptable variance, but sat at an angle that didn't match the operational activity logged beneath it. Small, possibly nothing. He noted it and moved on. Friday brought another. Different district, same angle. He filed both without comment, called no one, asked nothing. A man doesn't build what Marcus Vale built without developing a particular relationship with patterns. He had learned to trust them before he learned to trust people, and that instinct, sharpened now by 14 nights of genuine rest, was resurging with the quiet, total authority of something that had never actually left, only been buried. He said nothing to Ray. Not yet. But he began to watch. The way he used to watch. The way that in the years before Danny and the garage and the 2:04 a.m. that never ended, had made grown men in this city revise their decisions simply upon learning that Marcus Vale had begun paying attention. The dragon was not yet fully awake, but his eyes were open. He had spent 6 years learning how to survive the night, and he was only now remembering how to read the day. And what he's about to find will change everything. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Because what happens next is where Marcus Vale stops surviving and starts deciding, where the Empire fights back, and where Amara's place in his world becomes something neither of them planned for. Hit subscribe. You do not want to walk into what's coming without being here for it. Detroit at dawn carries its secrets the way it always has. In the grind of early traffic on Tier 75, in the neon still burning from the night before, in the particular silence of men who know too much moving through a city that has learned not to ask questions it doesn't want answered. The Vale estate was already awake. Marcus had been at his desk since 5. The files spread before him were not new. Yet most of them had been sitting in rotation for months, cycling through his review process with the mechanical regularity of a system running on autopilot, signed off on, filed, replaced by the next batch. He had read them the way a man reads when he is not sleeping, which is to say he had processed the surface and missed everything beneath it. He was not missing anything now. 14 nights of real sleep had returned his mind to him with the precision of something unlocked. The fog had lifted, not just the personal fog of grief and exhaustion, but the operational one. The subtle, compounding blur that 6 years of deprivation had laid across his judgment like sediment. Layer by layer, decision by decision, slowly enough that no single moment had announced the degradation. He could see it now, all of it. And what he saw made him very still. Ray's betrayal had no single fingerprint. That was the craft of it. The thing that confirmed, more than anything else, that Raymond Conti had been planning this long before the opportunity presented itself. It lived in accumulation, a strategic delay here, a loyalty quietly redirected there. 3 men in his inner circle, whose reporting, reviewed individually, fell within acceptable range, but laid side by side at 5 in the morning by a man with clear eyes and 14 years of pattern recognition, told a different story entirely. The architecture was almost elegant. Almost. Marcus closed the file, opened the next one, read it the same way, then sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment with the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped, as against his better instincts, was not true. He went downstairs. Amara was in the kitchen. Morning routine, unhurried, quiet, the particular domestic steadiness that had become, over 14 days, the sound of the house being inhabited rather than merely occupied. She placed a cup of coffee on the table without being asked, without comment, and returned to the counter. Marcus sat, looked at the cup, then at her. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" It came out plainly, not a test, not a calculation. The genuine question of a man who had spent so long measuring his worth in the fear he generated that he had forgotten there might be another unit of measurement entirely. Amara considered it the way she considered everything, without hurry, without performance. And she set down what she was holding and turned to face him with the unhurried patience that was simply, fundamentally, her nature. "Because afraid of you and careful around you are different things," she said. "I'm careful. I'm not afraid." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Slowly. Completely. The first honest nod he had given anyone in 6 years. Not the controlled acknowledgement of a man managing a room, but the simple, unguarded response of a person who has just received something true and recognized it as such. He picked up the coffee, drank it in silence. Outside, Detroit was fully awake now, the morning light moving across the river in long, flat panels, climbing the face of the estate until it reached the study window upstairs, where Danny's photograph sat on the shelf, 3 inches from the edge, at exactly where Amara had placed it. Safe, tended to, still present. The meeting had been called for Friday. Ray had been precise about it, as he was precise about everything. A private room at a restaurant in Midtown that officially hosted corporate dinners and unofficially understood that some conversations required guaranteed privacy and guaranteed discretion. 3 names, 1 document, a restructuring proposal that was, on its surface, a legitimate organizational consolidation, and was, beneath that surface, the legal and criminal transfer of the core of Marcus Vale's empire to a new structure with Raymond Conti at its center. 9 years of groundwork, 14 months of active repositioning. Friday was the conclusion of both. Marcus knew, not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand the geometry of it, the timeline, or the names involved. Enough to know that the man who had stood beside him in every significant room for nearly a decade had been, for at least 14 of those months, building a door out of that room and intending to lock it behind him. He sat in his study for a long moment after the morning light had fully settled. Danny's photograph on the shelf. The files closed on the desk before him. The coffee finished. The house quiet around him with the specific, inhabited quiet that it had not carried in 6 years. Then he picked up his phone. 2 calls, both brief, both delivered in the particular register he used when precision was the only thing that mattered. Quiet, unhurried, edged with the lethal calm of a man who has made a decision and has no further use for deliberation. And the men on the other end of those calls had known Marcus Vale for years. They understood immediately, not from what he said, but from the quality of how he said it, that something had fundamentally changed. The Marcus Vale who had been operating at diminished capacity for 6 years, the one they had quietly, carefully worked around, covering the gaps, absorbing the errors, managing the slow deterioration of a man who could not sleep and could not heal, that man was gone. The one who had replaced him was considerably more dangerous. He set the phone down, stood, crossed to the window. Detroit spread below him in the full morning light, the river catching it, the bridges holding it, the city moving through its Thursday with the indifferent momentum of a place that has survived too much to be impressed by any single thing. And he stood at the glass and looked at it the way he used to look at it. Completely, without the veil. Somewhere behind him, Amara moved through the house, the soft, unhurried sound of her presence filling the space without crowding it, occupying the rooms the way warmth occupies a room. Not loud, not announced. Simply there. He was not healed. He understood that. Danny was still gone, would always be gone, and that particular debt, the one that lived below the reach of sleep or time or any amount of rebuilt empire, could never be fully settled. The grief was not over. It had simply found its correct position, behind him rather than on top of him. Present but no longer structural. He was rested. He was clear. He was, for the first time in 6 years, entirely himself. Ray Conti had spent 9 years learning the geography of Marcus Vale's empire. He had spent 14 months quietly redrawing its borders. He had accounted for the sleeplessness, the deterioration, the revolving door of staff, the doctor's visits, the operational gaps. He had built his timeline around a man running on empty, and he had built it carefully. What he had not accounted for, what no one had accounted for, was the possibility that the man at the center of it would simply wake up. Friday was 3 days away. Marcus Vale had spent 6 years waiting for a night that didn't break him. He was done waiting for anything. And that's where we leave him. Standing at the window, rested, clear-eyed, and more dangerous than he has been in 6 years. The Empire is about to find out what happens when its king comes back to himself. If this story found you, if Marcus Vale and Amara's story moved something in you, then you already know what to do. Subscribe, leave a comment, share this with someone who needs to hear a story about what it looks like when a person finally finds their way back. We tell stories in the shadows here, stories about power, grief, healing, and the unexpected people who change everything. You won't want to miss what comes next. Welcome to the family.